Welcome to On Topic. I'm Jim Johnson, president of the University of Alaska. Our mission here at the university is to serve Alaska and its needs for higher education through world-class research, top quality education and training, and community service. Core to all three of those missions are conversations with experts from many, many different fields here in Alaska and across the country. Today, I'm really pleased to welcome Paula Mathieu. Paula's a professor at Boston College, and her expertise is in composition and writing and English. And Paula is known, nationally recognized for a groundbreaking work, Tactics of Hope, the public turn in English composition. And I really appreciate Paula's being here in Alaska. She's working with community leaders and our faculty on some very exciting initiatives that we'll talk about here this morning. So thanks for joining us. So I'll begin with why are you here in Alaska?
Well, I think that's in large part to one of your wonderful faculty members, Sarah Stanley in the English department, has a wonderful program working with correctional centers in and around all around Alaska. So they're creating a learning inside out network and trying to bring writing into correctional centers, bring writing courses into correctional centers, and then bring students back into the university once they're released. And so they're doing amazing things here, and then there's people in Juneau doing things, and someone wanting to start a program in Anchorage. And so Sarah really values conversation, and like you, and wanted to bring a lot of different people together, and felt that I could help facilitate some of those conversations. And so I was here to help run this think tank to bring all these people together, and it was been an amazing 3 days.
Wow. Well, thank you. Alaska leads the country in a lot of things, including incarceration. We have very high crime, unfortunately, in Alaska, and it's public safety, in fact, is the number one concern on the minds of Alaskans, according to recent public opinion polls. And I'm curious, writing, why writing? We often think that we need to, for folks who are in our correctional system, we need to, clean them of addiction, for example, or we need to teach them job skills. Why writing?
Well, I think that's a great question. I think there's practical reasons that being able to communicate, get into job programs. Sure. I think there's a lot of practical reasons for writing, but I also think everyone has stories, and those stories either help them, they have stories that make them feel capable and make them feel like they can change and their life can improve, or they have stories that make them feel very trapped and not appreciated. And I think getting people to write and share those stories can create a lot of community and create a lot of positive change.
Yeah, well, that's great. I often don't know what I think until I read it, meaning I need to write it.
Right.
And then as I go through that writing process, I figure things out. So I imagine that's a sort of experience that the people you work with are going through as well.
That and college students too. And then that's a hard thing with college students. I think they want to know what they have to say before they say it. They want to just be certain and then write it down, and to convince them that they have to go into a project not knowing what they think, and really writing to learn something can be scary but really satisfying and fun.
So you're really accomplished in your field, and you've given a lot to the field and spent many years in it. Where does your passion come from?
Well, that's a good question. Short answer is I was living in Chicago. I'm a Chicago native, and I started reading a newspaper I picked up one day, and it was called Streetwise newspaper, and it was a newspaper that's an income source for low-income or homeless people. And I read the most amazing story, and it was from a guy living in a single residence occupancy, which is very limited housing. And so he created a column, a food column, of things that you could make if you were living in that. So it was like, it was a recipe for chili, and it was how to make, so you couldn't use half a can of anything, and it really worked within the constraints of his life. And I was so amazed. It was funny, it was upbeat, but it really showed me, I learned a lot about the limitations of living in a single residence occupancy, and what his life was like through this one column. So at that moment I said, I really want to be part of whatever this organization is. So it started very slowly. I was a volunteer back in 1997. So I've kind of started that, I guess it's 20 years now of doing that work, and then slowly started editing things, creating a writing group, and then a learning center there. And then we did a lot of public performance. We did a bus tour of Chicago, an alternative bus tour of Chicago. So it's kind of thing that started one bit at a time, but I think, I don't know, my dad was Catholic, and but we never talked about religion. We didn't talk about a lot of things, but he always had a belief in justice and you know, in fairness, and he was very involved in his community and served on a lot of boards. So I think I got that from him, and you know, really enjoy working with people's stories. I think I'm kind of a shy person, so I like writing more than speaking sometimes. So I think that's part of it too.
Okay. You mentioned this increased sense of agency that people experience as they've gone through programs that you've been involved in. Can you say a little bit more about that? Either, you know, university students or folks you've worked in, for example, you know, the Streetwise program?
Well, I think there's different kinds of agency. Sometimes I worked with some students who were really smart and would have been amazing students at a place like University of Alaska or at University of Illinois, and they had defaulted student loan debt from previous before they were, or they were previous records of incarceration, and they couldn't find jobs anywhere, and so they found their paths forward blocked in a lot of ways, and in ways that I couldn't directly help them, and so some of that was doing some public writing to be able to say, you know, this is my story, and I want to go back to Malcolm X College or other places where they had been students. And one student, she was a young woman, she'd been on her own since she was 17 years old, and self-paid for college, got behind. A bill was sent to the wrong place. It was one of those. And so she had $6,000 of debt, and it was keeping her from moving forward. And there's a lot of rules around student loan debt. It can't be forgiven. It can't be, and so, you know, she wrote and told that story as part of a public performance, and then people started working with her, kind of saying, well, let's see if we can do that. So if we can fix things. So there's not always a direct fix. I mean, some of it is we need to change the hearts and minds of ordinary people to see people who are homeless or who have been imprisoned as worthy of resources and support. And so I think part of the writing is that, to just say, hey, I'm a person and I've got a story that's worth telling. But also that I think with a lot of the homeless men and women, that homelessness doesn't define them. That, you know, and same thing with people who are in correctional centers. You know, the worst thing they've done in their life shouldn't and maybe doesn't define them. And so writing a different kind of story.
You use the word define, and that's, I appreciate that. As I think about that word, we use it a lot in the academic world to specify. But it also limits, and I think it's that latter sense in which you're using the term, isn't it? Yeah, that's part of their story, that either being homeless or being in a correctional center or having committed crime is part of their story, but that they're much more complicated than that. And I think those, and there's also a lot of capabilities. You're right.
You know, and I think that's one thing I really drew me to Street Papers, is it wasn't a problem-focused project. It wasn't like, well, why, do you have a drinking problem, or why don't you have housing? Right. It was, hey, can you sell this paper? Can you be part of this writing group? And it was looking at people's capacities to do positive things. And I know someone I work with at the street paper in Boston. He had been a drug user for many years, and he said it was selling the paper and having positive interactions and writing for the paper that gave him the something positive in his life to then finally, get really stick to recovery. But he needed that something positive. And so if you had waited till he got over his drugs to give something positive in his life, it might not have happened. But, that I think everyone's worthy of, being seen as writers.
Right. You talk about hearts and minds. In a lot of my work, it's Excel spreadsheets and PowerPoint presentations, and I've increasingly been persuaded and completely believe that narrative and storytelling is more powerful even for affecting hearts and minds of people. Right. What's your take on that?
Well, it's been humbling because I'm a rhetorician by training, so I study persuasion. I study how people are persuaded, and more and more research is really showing that information actually has the opposite effect on people, and that beliefs are very deeply rooted in identity and sort of their sense of kinship in a group or a community. And so there was a study of people who didn't want to vaccinate their kids, and the more they were given information and facts, the less likely they were to vaccinate their kids. So it pushed them further and further into their own positions.
Right.
So it's been humbling for me to think, okay, I had taught courses in argumentation, and to really think, like, well, what am I actually teaching a useful skill? Is that how people are persuaded? And I really have found that it's through stories and it's through personal connections. When you know someone who's been homeless, you think of homelessness in a different way. When you know someone who's been incarcerated, you think about the problem of incarceration or the issues in different ways. And I think when we see people as part of our community, we're going to make more compassionate and better choices about what needs to happen or how resources should be allocated. And I think we see each other more through stories than we do through just facts and data.
Yeah, I was working with a group recently, and the group was organized for the purpose of advocacy. And along the lines of what you just said, I was thinking, advocacy has a bow wave. If it's just one-sided attempt at persuasion, even extremely sophisticated and rigorous and data-based, it can actually push people away, as opposed to an approach that is attempting to listen and integrate with what that other viewpoint might be.
Right.
So,
well, and it actually isn't so different from, what Aristotle, when he teaches about rhetoric, he says, first of all, know your audience. But also that the audience wants to participate in their own persuasion, and that, and he had this idea of the enthymeme, and where you leave the argument unfinished, that the discussion is unfinished, and so the audience has to supply the conclusion, or so it's like an unfinished syllogism, so they have to fit something in. And I think that's what story does. It's not telling you what to think or what to do, like you have to now make this choice. So it allows the listener, the agency, to process the story. And so that made me feel better, because I was a little worried, like, everything I've studied doesn't relate to the current moment.
Yeah. You mentioned Aristotle. I invoke him a lot, too. My field is political science. And in his Politics, he goes through the various types of political regime that were present in his time. And frankly, they're very similar to the range of political regimes we have today across the world. And then he looked at how these regime types degrade over time, perhaps natural processes.
Right.
And when he talked about democracy, he talked about it devolving into demagoguery. And I think we see that today, don't we? So as a as a rhetorician and someone who is involved in teaching university students, but also in the important community work that you're doing, what's your thought about that? Do you see that as someone who's, again, an expert in this field?
Yeah, well, yeah, personally, it's a hard moment because, again, all the rules of what we teach, not only university students, but I have a 10-year-old daughter, everything we teach our children, don't name call, don't be a bully, is the opposite of what we see in public discourse today. Yeah. And it's the opposite of what's working. And so for me, I'm fine with disagreeing with people about ideas and policies, but the vicious ad hominem attacks feels like a really deep attack on democracy. Because if we can't kind of share differing ideas and try to negotiate what the common good is, what kind of processes do we have? So it is hard, and it's a hard moment for teaching because of that. But I'm teaching a course right now, and it's connected with a core sociology class, and it's on issues of oppression and social change. So they learn all the stories of, histories of racism in the United States and sexism and so gender inequality and inequality based on sexual orientation and class inequality. So they're learning all that material, and then in my class we really focus on how do we do something meaningful with that information. And so it's and really asking students, what can we each do? Because I think it's easy, especially in a moment like this, to point your finger at externally at oh, look at this horrible person and look at all the horrible things they're doing. But really thinking about, well, in what small ways do I other people in that same way, or what ways does my language divisive, and do I kind of create the same kind of energy or the same kind of model that I am decrying so much? And so really trying to focus on ourselves at the same time as placing us into this bigger context of, what can we do on this campus? So right now my students are working on really local projects of, how do we help become more anti-racist on this campus, but with a focus on themselves first, and then maybe, having a conversation among their roommates, or having, or thinking about issues of class on our campus, which are there's a lot of wealthy students and a lot of very low-income students, and I think those lines can be very strong, and students don't cross them, and they don't make friends across those lines very often. And so how do we be a more inclusive campus in terms of that? And so it's a hard moment, but I also think it's a great opportunity, because I think the students don't want to live I don't think anyone really wants to live in a mean, angry, hateful world. So that's a common place we can start from.
Well, thank you. I appreciate very much the work. So what gives you hope as you look forward? I mean, clearly you have passion for your work. You're bringing a very rigorous intellectual background and approach to it. But as you work with not only your students, but people in the community and here in Alaska, what gives you hope?
Well, a lot of things. I think one, I always learn from people smarter than me, and I think that's, and I remember hearing very smart scholars of color saying, well, not having hope is a privilege. So the idea that to say, well, I'm hopeless, or that's someone who's in a comfortable enough position that they can live without hope, that their day-to-day life doesn't depend on that constant kind of tenacious reinventing and going out and facing. And so that I've always held very close, to not see hope as a choice, because it's an orientation. And I think conversations give me hope. This Lion think tank, we had people from the Fairbanks Correctional Center. We had people who had been just recently released from the Fairbanks Correctional Center. We had faculty from different disciplines. We had people from Juneau, people from Anchorage. spending 2 days together, we had some difficult conversations, and not everyone left agreeing on exactly, how to move forward. But there were a lot of very specific conversations about communications. People in Fairbanks Correctional Center have very limited ability to make phone calls and contact family members. And so how do you keep families intact when they can't even speak to each other? And the head of the center was there and was very open to, well, let's think about how we can work on this. And then there's a group that's going to be looking, because it's a for-profit organization, industry that now runs the telephone companies in the correctional centers. But there were people speaking about that, saying, I can talk for 15 seconds. This is what that call looks like. And how do I have a relationship with my son when I have 15 seconds to talk to him? And so I think that kind of sharing of information with a bunch of people. So now there's a group of people looking at that and saying, well, maybe we can't change it 100%, but what can we do to make this situation better? So that gives me hope that people can be very creative, especially when they get together and listen to each other. That gives me hope. And I also think, I don't know, I think humans give me hope. I mean, we're worth it, and our planet is worth it. And I don't think hope it's an orientation to being willing to not give up. It's not optimism and saying, oh, the answers are easy, but it's just it's an imperative, I think.
Yeah, I appreciate very much that thoughtful response, as I'm sure, you're dealing with people in difficult situations. Your work in Boston, obviously, but here in Alaska, I was reflecting as I was listening to you, how in the United States in particular, from early days, we've been different than folks in other countries in that we do come together as community organizations. Again, as a political scientist, I go back to Tocqueville, who was a French scholar who came to America and said, wow, these people identify challenges and they come together. Almost spontaneously, they come together in their communities and work on issues. And it sure seems like you're in that grand tradition, the work you're doing.
Well, and I think you raise a great point. Rebecca Solnit, who's an amazing writer, has a book, and it looks at disasters. It looks at Katrina and how the media kind of portrayed in that moment of Katrina of people looting and this kind of very racist depiction of what was going on in New Orleans, and they really looked, and none of it was true. It was all that when they really looked, that people did amazingly come together, but it was the fear stoked by these news stories had people blocking paths out of New Orleans because they had these fears of, the fleeing, hordes of people stranded in the city, and so that we need to tell better stories. And she talks about we need to break the story. So that was a story that, the poor African Americans, looted and destroyed New Orleans. That was not a true story. And she said, as journalists, we needed to break that story. And they did, and it's an amazing book. But what she said is what really happens over and over again in moments of big, horrible tragedies, people become very kind. People come together. That doesn't last forever, but that was what she found both in Katrina, and then she compared that to the San Francisco earthquake, and looking at that. So I think that's really true.
Well, I was in New Orleans just a few weeks ago, and was in a cab going back out to the airport from my meeting downtown. And a gentleman was driving the cab. I asked him how long he's been in New Orleans, and he gave me a date, and it was certainly from before Katrina.
Right.
And I asked him, what was your experience during Katrina? I said, well, I'd left for about a week, and I came back and went to work. What were you doing? Rebuilding the city.
Yeah.
And so it's an example of your story, that people came back and went to work to rebuild. And it was beautiful. I didn't spend a lot of time on many parts of the city, but certainly in the French Quarter, it was very, very nice.
Yeah.
So they did come together. So
wonderful.
Yeah.
It's a great story.
Yeah, we often talk about that up here in the interior of Alaska because it can be very, very cold. It's certainly winter here, but it can get to 40, 50 below here. And sometimes people will ask me, why do you live there? And I say, well, when it's 50 degrees, minus 50 degrees outside, and somebody's pulled over in the ice fog, that's one of the things that happens here. People pull over, and it doesn't matter where they're from, what color their skin, what job they have, they pull over to help. So there's
that happened to me yesterday.
Oh, did it?
Okay. I took my daughter dog sledding up in the hills, and I rented a car that was not terribly suited. It had snow tires, but it didn't do great on the quite hilly roads. So someone was coming behind me on the way back, and I knew I was going to go slower, so I just pulled over and waved them around, and they stopped and they said, "Are you okay?"
Yeah.
And I said, "Oh, thank you for asking." I said, "I'm fine. I just figured you know these roads better than I do and would go more quickly." And they said, "Well, we wouldn't want you to be, in trouble, and we just wanted to ask." And my daughter said, "That would not happen in Boston."
Right.
And so there is something special about, I think, being in a place where there is a remoteness that people really realize they're imperative to help each other. I think it's beautiful.
Yeah, it's what keeps us here, that's for sure.
Yeah, and it's a beautiful area too. So
well, it's part of our university culture as well, because we represent people from all across Alaska and even the country and the world here. So it's a great place, and has been since literally when we opened our doors in 1922. It's a place where diverse people from many, many places can come together and work together and learn together. So we take great pride in that.
Yeah, wonderful. It's a wonderful campus.
Yeah. So what's next for you? What are you thinking about for your work going forward?
Well, I'm working on two different kinds of things right now. One, I think from my community work, I realized the interpersonal dysfunction that is part and parcel with getting any group of people to try to solve a problem. There's always group dynamics and trouble, and that's actually led me to think much more about contemplative work and feeling like we each need to do our own work internally, and to think about how am I bringing either peace or conflict into any situation, and how do I prepare to sit, because as someone in the university, I represent something that's very painful to people who've been locked out of university situations, or people who might have a background in correctional centers, and to be able to hear the anger or critiques that might not be about something I've personally done, but that I certainly have benefited from and represent. And so part of it's been thinking about doing a lot of mindfulness and other kind of work just to help me be a more grounded person, and looking about how to bring that more into the classroom. And I've been connected with a wonderful organization for the Association for the Contemplative Mind in Higher Education. And they do these 5-day summer workshops, and I've gone twice. And so I've been writing about that. And then I've been doing some nonfiction writing about my own family to really understand the stories that shaped me. I think part of the work of understanding ourselves is to really understand kind of the traumas and the dynamics and things that that might be my own speed bumps or other things in my life. So I go to a writing workshop every Monday night and show up with 750 new words every week and plug along with that, which is a lot of fun. So you're walking the talk. Yeah, and it's been good to do that, because for a long time I've never done much personal writing, and it is the hardest thing I've ever done in my life. So it's fun, but scary. But having a group of people who are also working on their things, we just share 750 words a time. That I can do. I don't know what lies beyond that, but for now I can do that.
Well, that's really wonderful to build that habit. When we try to build and strengthen cultures, that's a hard thing to do, and it sounds like that's some of the work you're doing, is to try to build cultures of acceptance and inclusion and respect. That's a major initiative we have here at the University of Alaska, is trying to build a culture of respect.
I think that's the most important thing, because if people truly respected each other and saw each other as equal in dignity and value, I think it would change the way all kinds of political, economic discussions would take place. It's only when we really believe someone is other or less than or less worthy that I think all the trouble happens. I think that's a heavy order to happen, to really make people sort of recognize the inherent dignity of all, people and the planet. I think, really recognizing that. Being up here in Alaska, you're on the front lines of climate change. So
absolutely.
It feels like to me the public imperative is, it's not about facts. The scientists know the facts. It's about the hearts and minds and the will of all of us to maybe change our lifestyle and to, change what we're doing in order to save the planet for future generations.
It's really ironic here, of course, because we are on the front line of climate change, and at the same time we're a natural resource economy.
Right.
And how we address that dilemma, because it's an existential dilemma for us, is an interesting one, and we struggle with it. We work through it a lot here.
Yeah. Well, we're all contradictory, and Alaska's humans are contradictory, and I think, and that's why we can't all be summed up by the worst thing or the best thing that any of us have ever done.
Well, I really appreciate this introspective perspective that you're bringing to your work, because you're right, we often externalize responsibility for things. We infer motivation based on observation when we have no idea what's going on in that other person's mind. And so listening to them and really in a humble way, I think is really powerful, and then combine that with listening to ourselves.
Right, and not jumping to a story of, oh, this is this type of person, that we put people in boxes very, very quickly before we've even had a conversation. And so I think trying to just slow that down, or to be aware of, oh, am I putting someone in a box? And so it's not easy. I mean, I'll be like, that politician, it's very easy for me to fall into that, but then to just notice and be like, oh, well, is this really helping make the world, more peaceful? Or, and I don't think it does. And, even something as small as social media, like as much as when I find something, like there's a lot of funny, but, very, ad hominem kind of attacks. And I've kind of made a choice that, not to circulate those things, and to just sort of say, okay, I'm not going to add to fuel to the fire. It's a very small thing, but and to not sort of engage in sort of confrontational ways on social media. That I feel like there's so much of that in our culture, and I don't think it's helping anything. And so trying to really only posting things about things I am for, and if someone wants to disagree with that, that's fine, but about things that I feel positively towards, rather than and that's not to say critique isn't important, but I feel like in the public we're at such a critique saturated moment that I don't think they need mine right now.
Well, you use the word mindfulness, and you just shared an example of mindfulness in your engagement with social media. I look at it, I don't post things generally, but I do look at it, and I see a lot of smart people being mindless, frankly, and so I think a little more.
A lot.
And so a little more.
You mentioned listening. I think if they listen more and talked 50% less, we'd all be a little better. There's an acronym that they use in activist circles called HALT, about posting on social media. Are you hungry, angry, lonely, or tired? Then you probably shouldn't post right now.
That's helpful counsel, especially even writing emails in response to people. That's pretty good. I'll remember that. Yeah. Well, thank you. Well, thank you so much for your time here today, and for all the work you're doing here in Fairbanks, but also because there were folks from across the state for Alaska. I really appreciate it, and we hope that we stay connected with you, because you're doing important work for society. And
I love Alaska. This is my first visit here, and I've been here a week, and it's been amazing. And so thank you for the opportunity, and thank you for wanting to sit down.
Oh, yeah. And we look forward to seeing you back.
Okay, great.
Okay. Well, thank you.
Okay.
Okay. Really appreciate it.
Bye. No, thank you.